The night was a wound split open by the pale glow of a dying moon. The ruins of the cathedral stood like broken teeth against the sky, its shattered stained glass casting jagged shadows over the blood-slicked stone. And there, in the center of it all, she stood, Selene. Her dress, once the color of midnight silk, was torn and stained. Her skin, pale as the first frost, gleamed with sweat and the remnants of battle. She was exhaustion given form, her chest rising in shallow breaths, her fingers trembling around the hilt of her silver dagger. But her eyes, those burned, dark as old wine, sharp as the edge of a blade. She had fought too many, killed too many. The bodies of lichen hunters lay around her, their throats torn out, their chests carved open. But she was not unscathed. A deep gash ran across her ribs, blackened by wolfsbane. Her legs threatened to buckle, yet she did not fall, because she was Selene of the Crimson Court, and she would die on her feet. A growl slithered through the ruins, low, rumbling, the sound of something ancient and hungry. Her head snapped up, her fangs bared. Another enemy, another beast come to finish what the others had started. Then she saw him. Emerging from the shadows like a nightmare-given flesh, the werewolf was massive. His fur was the color of storm clouds, his shoulders broad enough to block out the moon. Claws, long and curved, scraped against stone as he moved, but it was his eyes that froze her, golden, molten, burning with something far more dangerous than mere bloodlust. He did not attack. He watched. Selene tightened her grip on her dagger. "Come to finish me off, beast." Her voice was a whisper raw from battle, but it carried the weight of a queen's command. The werewolf tilted his head. Then, with a grace that defied his size, he stepped forward. His scent hit her, wilderness iron, the musk of a predator who had known no master. She should have recoiled. Instead, her body reacted, a traitorous heat coiling low in her stomach. He circled her, nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. The air between them thickened, charged with something unspoken. When he finally spoke, his voice was a rough growl, the words shaped by a throat more used to howls than speech. "You fight like death herself." Selene scoffed, but her pulse betrayed her, hammering against her throat. "Flattery won't save you when I slit your throat." A dark chuckle rumbled from his chest. "Little viper, you can barely stand." She hated that he was right, hated that he saw through her, but most of all, she hated the way her body ached at the sound of his voice. Before she could retort, the wind shifted. A new scent, lichens, fresh hunters, drawn by the bloodshed. The werewolf's ears twitched, his body tensing. Selene braced herself. If she was going to die tonight, she would take as many with her as she could. But then, the werewolf moved, not toward her, but past her, positioning himself between her and the approaching threat. His muscles coiled, his growl deepening into something primal. "Run," he snarled. Selene blinked. "What?" "Run, now." She should have. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to survive. But something stupid, something reckless, made her stay. "Why?" she demanded. His golden eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time she saw something beyond the beast, something human. Because no one else will. Then the lichens burst into the clearing, and the night erupted into violence once more. But this time, Selene was not alone. This time, she had a monster fighting beside her. And God's help her, she liked it. Blood painted the ruins in thick, glistening strokes. The air reeked of iron and wet fur, of death and something darker, something alive. The lichens came like a tide, their yellowed fangs bared, their claws tearing at the earth. But they did not expect him. The feral werewolf moved like a storm given teeth. Selene watched, her breath trapped in her throat, as he tore through them. His claws split flesh from bone with terrifying ease. His snarls were not just sound. They were violence made real, shaking the ground beneath her feet. He fought with no strategy, no elegance, only pure, undiluted fury. And yet there was something almost beautiful in it. She should have run. She should have vanished into the night while he was distracted. But she didn't, because she couldn't look away. When the last lichen fell, its throat ripped out, the werewolf turned to her. His golden eyes burned through the darkness, his chest heaving. Blood matted his fur, dripped from his jaws. He was monstrous, magnificent. Celine's fingers twitched around her dagger. I didn't need your help, she lied. He huffed, a sound too close to a laugh. You're welcome. She scowled. I didn't thank you. You will. The arrogance in his voice should have infuriated her. Instead, it sent a slow, dangerous heat curling through her veins. She stepped forward, her boots crushing broken glass. Who are you? He tilted his head, studying her like she was prey he had no intention of killing. Kale. Just a name, but it felt heavy in the air between them. Celine lifted her chin. Why did you save me? Kale took a step closer, then another. The distance between them shrank, and with it, her ability to think straight. It scent wrapped around her, wilderness and storm winds, the musk of a beast who had never bowed to anyone. When he spoke, his voice was a low growl. Maybe I just wanted to see if you taste as good as you fight. Her breath hitched, not from fear. Never from fear. She bared her fangs in a sharp smile. Try it and lose your tongue. He leaned in, his muzzle brushing the space just below her ear. His breath was hot against her skin. Promise? She should have stabbed him. She should have shoved him away. Instead, she held still, her pulse a frantic drumbeat beneath her skin. Then, just as suddenly as he had closed the distance, Kale pulled back. His ears twitched, his gaze snapping to the tree line. They're coming again. Celine didn't ask who. She already knew. The lichens would never stop hunting her. Not until she was dead. Kale looked down at her, his expression unreadable. You can't keep fighting alone. I don't need. You do. His voice left no room for argument, and I'm not offering. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to spit in his face and walk away. But she was so tired, and he was right. Celine exhaled sharply. Fine, but if you try anything, you'll kill me. He bared his teeth in something that wasn't quite a smile. I'd like to see you try. Before she could retort, Kale turned and vanished into the shadows. For a heartbeat, Celine hesitated. Then, with a curse, she followed. The beast had her. And for the first time in centuries, she wasn't sure she wanted to escape. The forest swallowed them whole. Trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the bruised sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something wilder, something that made Celine's skin prickle with awareness. Kale moved ahead of her, a shadow among shadows, his massive form cutting through the underbrush with ease. She followed, but not too close, never too close. Yet her eyes kept drifting to the way his muscles shifted beneath his fur, to the lethal grace of a predator who had never known defeat. It infuriated her. Where are you taking me? Her voice was a blade in the dark. Kale didn't slow. Somewhere they won't find you. And why should I trust you? He stopped then, so suddenly she nearly collided with him. When he turned, his golden eyes burned through the night. You shouldn't. The honesty in his voice startled her. Before she could respond, a twig snapped somewhere to their left. Kale's ears flattened, his growl a vibration in the air between them. Run. Celine didn't argue this time. They ran. The forest blurred around them, branches whipping at her skin, her breath coming in sharp bursts. She was faster than any human but Kale. Kale was something else. He matched her pace effortlessly, his presence a constant at her side, a reminder that she wasn't alone. It should have comforted her. It didn't. When they finally stopped, it was in a clearing bathed in moonlight. A crumbling ruin stood at its center, half consumed by vines. Kale didn't hesitate, slipping inside with the ease of a creature who knew every inch of this place. Celine followed, her dagger still in hand. The inside was surprisingly intact. The remnants of a fire pit sat in one corner, the ashes long cold. Animal pelts were strewn across the floor, and the scent of Kale, deep and musky, clung to everything. This was his den, his territory. Celine's grip tightened on her weapon. You brought me to your lair. Kale turned to face her, his gaze unreadable. You needed shelter. I don't need anything from you. Liar. The word hung between them, heady with meaning. Celine bared her fangs. You don't know me. I know you're exhausted. He took a step closer. I know you're hurt. Another step. And I know you're lying to yourself if you think you can survive this alone. She wanted to argue, wanted to drive her dagger into his chest just to prove him wrong. But the truth was a weight she couldn't shake. She was tired, so tired. When she swayed, Kale was there in an instant, his claws catching her arm before she could fall. The contact sent a jolt through her, his touch searing even through the fabric of her sleeve. She jerked back, but his grip held firm. "Let go," she hissed. "Make me." Challenge flashed in his eyes, daring her to try. Celine reacted without thinking. Her free hand lashed out, her nails raking across his muzzle. Kale snarled, but he didn't release her. Instead, he yanked her closer, his body pressing hers against the stone wall. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, her dagger clattering to the ground. For a heartbeat, they were frozen. His breath was hot against her lips, his growl vibrating through her chest. She could feel the power in him, the barely leashed violence. One wrong move, and he could tear her apart. She should have been afraid. She wasn't. Instead, something dark and hungry uncoiled inside her, whispering that she could tear him apart too. Their eyes locked. Neither moved. Then, slowly, Kale leaned in, his muzzle brushing the curve of her throat. His breath seared her skin as he inhaled deeply, as if memorizing her scent. When he spoke, his voice was rough, raw. "You smell like blood and moonlight." Celine's pulse stuttered. She should have shoved him away. She didn't. Instead, her fingers tangled in his fur, her nails digging in just enough to make him growl. "Let me go," she whispered. Kale pulled back just enough to meet her gaze. His eyes burned with something that made her stomach tighten. "Say it like you mean it." She couldn't. Because she didn't. The realization was a blade to her pride. Before she could respond, Kale released her, stepping back with a smirk that made her want to stab him all over again. "Rest, little viper. You'll need your strength." Celine glared. "For what?" His grin was all teeth. "For the fight you're going to lose." Then he was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the ruin, leaving her alone with the echo of his words and the heat of his touch still burning on her skin. The night lulled into something quieter. Celine sat with her back against the cold stone of the ruin, her fingers tracing the gash along her ribs. The wolfsbane burned like acid in her veins, a persistent throb that refused to fade. She clenched her jaw, refusing to let the pain show. Weakness was death, and she would not die here. Not in front of him. Kale watched her from across the fireless pit, his golden eyes reflecting the fractured moonlight. He hadn't spoken since their clash, but his gaze never left her. It was infuriating, intoxicating, like being stalked by a storm that refused to break. "Stop staring," she snapped. His ear twitched. "Make me." The same challenge as before, the same reckless heat curling low in her stomach. She bared her fangs. "I will carve your eyes out." He huffed, a sound too close to amusement. "You're welcome to try." Celine hissed, pushing to her feet, and immediately regretted it. The wound flared white-hot, her vision swimming. She swayed, catching herself against the wall, but not fast enough. Kale was there before she could fall. His massive frame blocked out the world, his claws gentle but unyielding as they gripped her shoulders. The contact seared through her, his heat a brand against her chilled skin. She wanted to shove him away, wanted to sink her fangs into his throat. Instead, she froze. "Let go," she breathed. "No." His refusal was a rumble against her bones. Before she could protest further, he bent, one arm sliding behind her knees, the other bracing her back. Then she was weightless, cradled against his chest like something precious. Celine snarled, thrashing. "Put me down. Stop fighting me." His voice was edged with something dangerous. "You're bleeding out." She stilled, not because he commanded it, but because she heard it, the faintest thread of concern beneath the growl. It unsettled her more than any threat. Kale carried her deeper into the ruin, to an alcove lined with pelts. He set her down with surprising care, his claws retracting as he brushed the torn fabric of her dress aside to examine the wound. His touch was clinical, but his breath hitched when she flinched. "Wolfsbane," he muttered. "Stupid to let them hit you." "I was a little busy," she bit out. His lips peeled back in a snarl. "You should have run when I told you to." I don't take orders from beasts. You will. The promise in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. Kale turned away, rummaging through a pile of dried herbs and tattered cloth. When he returned, his hands were stained with something dark and pungent. Celine recoiled. What is that? Medicine. His gaze locked onto hers. It will hurt. She laughed, sharp and brittle. I've survived worse. He didn't smile. Just pressed the poultice to her wound. Fire erupted across her skin. Celine arched, a scream trapped behind her teeth. Her claws lashed out, raking down Kale's chest, drawing blood. He didn't flinch, didn't stop, just held her down with one hand, the other working the poison from her flesh with relentless precision. When it was over, she was trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Kale's fur was matted with sweat, his own wounds ignored as he wrapped a strip of cloth around her ribs. His touch was careful, almost tender. It made her chest ache. Why? She whispered. He stilled. Why what? Why bother? She met his gaze, her own burning with something she couldn't name. You could have left me to die. Kale's claws flexed against her skin. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then so quiet she almost missed it. Because no one ever did for me. The raw honesty in his voice shattered something inside her. Celine reached up without thinking, her fingers brushing the scars that marred his muzzle. Kale froze, his breath catching. She expected him to pull away, to snap. Instead, he leaned into her touch. The world narrowed to this, her cold fingers on his heated skin, his breath mingling with hers, the space between them shrinking with every heartbeat. She should have stopped. She didn't. Neither did he. Dawn threatened the horizon, but the ruin held onto the night like a secret. Celine lay still, her body humming with the aftermath of pain and something else, something she refused to name. Kale's poultice had dulled the wolfsbane's burn, but the heat of his touch lingered, branding her in ways no wound ever could. She watched him through half-lidded eyes as he moved through the den, his silhouette a jagged cutout against the fading dark. He hadn't spoken since he tended to her. The silence was a living thing between them. She broke it first. You weren't alpha. It wasn't a question. Kale froze, his back to her. The tension in his shoulder spoke louder than any snarl. Once. What happened? He turned then, his golden eyes glinting in the dim light. I refuse to kneel. The words were a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Celine understood that kind of pride. It was the same pride that had cost her the Crimson Court, the same pride that had left her bleeding in the dirt. She pushed herself up, ignoring the protest of her ribs. Who made you bow? A growl rumbled in his chest. My brother. The admission hung heavy in the air. Celine saw it then, the shadow of betrayal in his gaze, the scars that ran deeper than flesh. She knew that look. She wore it herself. He took your pack, she murmured. I let him. Kale's claws flexed, digging into the stone. I could have torn his throat out. Should have. His gaze locked onto hers. But I walked away instead. Celine tilted her head. Why? Because the man I was died that night. He stepped closer, his scent wrapping around her like a claim. Only the beast remained. She should have recoiled, should have reminded him she was no one's prey. Instead, she met him halfway. I know what that's like, she whispered. His breath hitched. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Kale's hand rose, his claws tracing the curve of her cheek with a gentleness that belied his strength. You're still in there, he murmured. The woman, the fighter. His thumb brushed her lower lip. The killer. Celine's fangs ached. You don't know me. I know you're just like me. His voice dropped, rough as gravel. Alone, angry, hungry for something you can't name. Her pulse stuttered. He was too close, too much. She bared her fangs in a smirk. You think you know what I hunger for. I know what you won't admit. His nose grazed her throat, inhaling deeply. Even to yourself. A shudder racked her frame. She wanted to shove him away, wanted to drag him closer. The conflict burned through her, leaving her breathless. Tell me to stop, he growled. She didn't. Kale's lips brushed the shell of her ear, his next words a dark promise. That's what I thought. Then he was gone, striding toward the ruin's entrance, leaving her trembling in his wake. Celine's claws dug into the pelts beneath her. She should hate him, should want him dead. So why did the thought of him walking away make her chest ache worse than any wound? The forest held its breath. Moonlight dripped through the canopy like liquid silver, painting the ruins in ghostly light. Celine stood at the edge of the crumbling stone, her fingers curled around the dagger at her hip. Behind her, Cale paced, a restless shadow, his growls vibrating through the earth beneath her feet. They had been silent too long. "They'll come at dawn," she said finally. Cale stopped. "I know." His voice was rougher than usual. When she turned, she found his gaze already on her, molten gold in the dark. The intensity of it sent heat licking up her spine. "Then why aren't we running?" she challenged. He bared his teeth in a smile that wasn't kind. "You don't run. Neither do I." "Stupid," she muttered, but the word lacked its usual bite. Cale closed the distance between them in 3 strides. Its scent, wilderness, and storm-wet fur, wrapped around her, drowning out the night. When he spoke, his breath warmed her lips. "Tell me you want to leave. Say it, and I'll let you go." Liar. She saw the truth in his eyes. If she tried to walk away now, he'd chase her. Not to kill, not to hurt, but because something in him couldn't stand the thought of her vanishing into the dark alone. Just like something in her couldn't stand the thought of him letting her. Celine lifted her chin. "I don't take orders from you." "No," he agreed, his claws tracing the line of her jaw. "You take nothing from anyone." His thumb pressed against her bottom lip, just shy of painful. "But you could take from me." Her breath hitched. She should have stabbed him, should have laughed in his face. Instead, her fangs ached. "What are you offering?" she whispered. Cale's growl was a living thing between them. "Whatever you're brave enough to take." The challenge hung in the air, thick as smoke. Celine's pulse roared in her ears. She could taste the hunger on him, the barely leashed need. It mirrored her own, the dark, twisting thing she refused to name. She named it now. Her hand fisted in his fur, yanking him down. Their lips crashed together in a clash of fang and fury. Cale snarled into her mouth, his claws digging into her hips hard enough to bruise. It wasn't gentle, wasn't sweet. It was a claiming, a battle. And she gave as good as she got. Her teeth scraped his lower lip, drawing blood. The coppery tang flooded her senses, igniting something primal. Cale groaned, the sound vibrating through her chest as he backed her against the stone wall. His body pinned hers, all heat and hard muscle, his growls a constant rumble against her skin. She could have stopped him, could have killed him. She didn't. When he tore his mouth from hers to trail hot, open-mouthed kisses down her throat, she arched into him with a gasp. His teeth grazed her pulse, not biting, not yet, but the promise was there. A question. Her answer was a hand fisted in his fur, dragging him closer. "Mine," he growled against her skin. Celine laughed, breathless. "You wish." Cale pulled back just enough to meet her gaze. His eyes burned. "Say it." She knew what he wanted, the admission, the surrender. She gave him neither. Instead, she leaned in, her lips brushing his ear. "Make me." His answering snarl was all the warning she got before he hauled her off the wall, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her back into the ruins. The pelts were soft beneath her, his weight a delicious pressure as he hovered over her. Outside, the wind howled. Dawn was coming. So was war. But here in the dark, there was only this. The slide of skin on fur, the scrape of fangs, the whispered promises neither would say aloud. Cale's mouth found hers again, slower this time, deeper. When he pulled back, his voice was rough with something that wasn't just hunger. "If we survive this," he murmured, "I'm claiming you in every way a beast can." Celine's smile was all sharp edges. "If we survive," she whispered back, "I'll let you." The world burned at the edges. First light clawed its way over the horizon, staining the sky the color of a fresh wound. The forest, once silent, now trembled with the thunder of approaching footsteps. Too many to count, too many to survive. Celine stood at the mouth of the ruin, her silver dagger catching the pale glow of dawn. Behind her, Cale's growl rolled through the earth like an earthquake. She didn't need to look to know his eyes were molten gold, his claws already slick with anticipation. They were coming, and she was ready. Last chance to run, she murmured. Kale's muzzle brushed the curve of her shoulder, a fleeting touch that burned through the thin fabric of her dress. Never. The word was a vow. Then the trees exploded. Lichens poured into the clearing like a flood of teeth in fury. Celine moved before the first snarl finished echoing, her blade the silver flash in the half-light. She danced between them, all grace and deadly precision. Her fangs bared in a smile as blood sprayed the air. Kale fought like the beast he was, no strategy, no finesse, just raw, untamed destruction. His claws shredded through flesh, his snarls shaking the bones of the earth. They moved in tandem, back to back, a lethal symmetry of fang and claw. But there were too many. Celine's breath came in sharp gasps, her muscles screaming. A lichen's claws raked her thigh. Another's teeth grazed her arm. She barely felt the pain. All that mattered was the next kill, the next step, until the world tilted. A massive lichen, larger than the others, his fur streaked with scars, barreled into Kale with the force of a falling star. They crashed to the ground, a whirlwind of snapping jaws and tearing claws. Celine saw the moment Kale faltered, saw the glint of silver in the lichen's grip. A poisoned blade. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She lunged, her dagger sinking into the lichen's throat. He howled, twisting at the last second, and the silver meant for Kale buried itself in her side instead. White-hot agony seared through her veins. Celine collapsed, her vision swimming. Distantly, she heard Kale's roar, a sound of pure, unbridled rage. The air itself seemed to shudder. Then the lichen was gone, torn apart in a spray of blood and viscera. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Kale's face swam above her, his golden eyes wide with something she'd never seen before. Fear. Celine. Her name was a prayer on his lips. She laughed, even as blood bubbled past her teeth. Looks like I win. His claws trembled against her skin. Don't you dare. The poison worked fast. Her limbs grew heavy, her vision darkening at the edges. She could feel it, death, cold and patient, reaching for her. She wasn't ready. Not like this. Not when she'd just found. Kale's growl cut through the haze. Mine. Then his fangs sank into her throat. Fire erupted in her veins. Celine arched, a scream tearing from her lips as something ancient and wild flooded her system. Kale's blood, hot and thick, filled her mouth as he pressed his wrist to her lips. Drink, he snarled. She'd obeyed. The world shattered. When Celine opened her eyes, everything was sharper, brighter. The scent of blood was intoxicating, the thunder of Kale's heartbeat a drum in her ears. She felt his power thrumming beneath her skin, a living thing, wild and untamed, just like him. Kale stared down at her, his chest heaving. His fur was matted with blood, his eyes burning with something feral, possessive. Say it, he demanded. Celine bared her fangs, newly sharp, newly deadly, in a smile. Yours. His answering howl shook the heavens.